If you want to unmute yourself, then unmute yourself. Otherwise, otherwise we'll leave folks quiet. If you want to unmute yourself, then unmute yourself. Otherwise, I gotta mute myself, or at least myself from a few seconds ago. There we go. All right. So, thank you for joining us, us tonight, because every so often we got to switch to Zoom. Sometimes it'll be because there's a snowstorm. Sometimes it'll be maybe I don't have childcare, and sometimes it'll be because the FBI talks about a threat to New Jersey synagogues. So this is for the latter. To be perfectly honest, this is for the latter reason. It's not weather. It's nice out, and it's not for childcare reasons. It's because you probably saw. The FBI said it's that. So anyway, I've been before we get to anything else, the Bridgewater chief of police sent a uniformed officer over a number over the course of the day, but one relatively recently to say that the threat has been mitigated. I mean, there's no that there's no threat isn't around anymore. Not local to Somerset County, nothing to worry about. But by the time we had already sent out a message by the time the word reached me. The Secure Communities Network, which is the consortium of synagogues and security experts, became more prominent during the Colleyville terrorist incident of about a year ago. Sent a message out saying, we recommend, due to the FBI threat, we recommend that all synagogues in New Jersey cancel their live in-person events for tonight. So I debated it, but I did that. I'm not terribly freaked out. It can be evidenced by the fact that I'm sitting here in said synagogue. But it's almost like weather threats. When they say to close schools for snow or rain, we're supposed to do so. And last year we didn't do so on Hurricane Ida, and we had people who did not get home that night. Thank God they were okay in the end, but who didn't get home. So after that happened, I'm like, when there's a weather threat, I'm going to listen to it. So the same thing for this. When there's like a security threat, I'm going to listen to it. So that's why we made it virtual tonight. Makes sense. Hold on a second. I have to text my mother to assure her that I'm okay. This is what happens when these sort of things happen. So that look, that's something worthy to talk about. The fact that there are threats that are out there. This is just the world we live in. You are all old enough to know that it is never easy to be a Jew. You're also historically aware enough to know that that it's never been easier to be a Jew. Meaning, most times in history, there's been greater threats than the ones that we face, or more broadly, or more to the point. We've had police and sheriff's officers all around this place today. And when the authorities are on your side, it gives you an extra dose of confidence. So Baruch Hashem, we have good relations with local law enforcement, and it's a nice thing. The mayor called my cell phone, like we're good. So like this. That's why we're virtual. Pause. Anyone have anything to throw in, or should we move on? All right then.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I think this raises a lot of bigger questions. I don't know if there's the forum to go into those, obviously, but I think for myself, what is the proper response to something like this? Do you just go on, ignore it, and go on, or do you confront it in some way by living the Jewish institutions as they always had been, or doing something more affirmatively to try to flesh out, not celebrate the anti-Semite, but to bring to bear what anti-Semitism is?
It's hard because I mean you don't. So good question. It's not clear to me. One, for me again, it's never been easy to be Jewish. Like, so the key thing is not to be scared away from it. There are people who are scared away from it. People who are like afraid to go into synagogues anymore, or JCCs, or whatever the case may be. That's the wrong thing. That, like, I really think I'm not a big fan of the then the terrorists win sort of language, but then the terrorists win. So one, that but also, like, we don't know, or certainly I don't know, like, for this specific threat tonight, like, who knows where it comes from? And this is the key thing with modern anti-Semitism, which is that it obviously exists on the right and on the left, or on the extreme right and the extreme left, right? Like this is the shooter of the Pittsburgh synagogue was from the extreme right, and the shooter of the kosher deli in Jersey City was a Black Hebrew, which is sort of like, I don't know, like off the, that can be triangulated anywhere, but it's certainly not right wing. The Colleyville hostage taker, flew there from London to do it as Muslim conspiracy theorists. You got Kanye, you got Kyrie. Like, it's all over, right? Like, so I don't, it's hard to know like what to strike against, other than strike against it wherever it appears.
Yeah, my concern, Rabbi, was about you mentioned Kyrie and Kanye West. This opens up a whole new category that's been latent for many, many years, and the youth today are as tied into history as we are, the civil rights movement, et cetera, et cetera. Now this opens up a whole legion of young African Americans that are following these people that are on social media, which is really the part of the root cause of all these issues as well.
Yeah, right. It's social media not censoring things. And I have to say, with Kyrie specifically, like, sort of like my reaction, like after Shabbat, I looked at my phone and saw that this controversy had blown up, and that he had linked to an anti-Semitic movie that was on Amazon. And my first reaction is like, it was on Amazon? Like, sort of like, they're capable of curating content.
And of all places to be anti-Semitic on a basketball team, Brooklyn, New York, the largest Jewish community outside of Israel.
Right. Yeah. So right. So I mean, there's a lot of things going on there. The bottom line is it truly is everywhere, as bigotries are, but very specifically anti-Semitism, and very specifically it's this virulent form that morphs into whatever people need it to be. So the form that it is for the, what it seems to be, these last incidents, Kanye West, etc., is that the Jew as the white, ultra white oppressor of the of blacks, and for the shooter in Pittsburgh, it's the pretending to be white enabler of other ethnic minorities, of people of color, that they're changing, that Jews are leading to changing the nature of America into a nation of different, like, so whatever it is that they want it to be, that's what it is. Whatever, we're the masters of capitalism, we're the masters of communism. So that, it's everywhere. It's worth speaking out against. I do think it's important to be to assert ourselves in it, and not to be afraid to live Jewish lives publicly. And that's the only way it works, because it's not going anywhere. And the blessing, of course, is that the authorities are on it, and pay attention to it.
Rabbi, I think that's a critical distinction. I think Neil's comment about Brooklyn is significant in a way also, but I think, unlike what happened 90 years ago in Europe, this is not state-sponsored anti-Semitism, at least at this point. And I think we have to be on our guard to ensure that continues. And without becoming partisan, but that's something that has to be reckoned with, because there are certain people in public life who tend to espouse anti-Semitic comments, and that has to be condemned, I think, at every level.
The key thing is doing it even when it's on your side. There are politicians like to do it when it's a matter of political convenience. They'll call out the other side, but they won't say it when it's sometimes when it's
Right.
on their own side. That's the test of, are they sincere or are they just using this to score points?
Well, and I think, yeah, the one thing that I find kind of strange, Neil's comment about Brooklyn being such a large Jewish community. Certainly Squirrel Hill, where the Tree of Life took place. You can't find a more Jewish cloistered area, certainly outside the New York or Los Angeles metropolitan areas. And yet it happened there. So being visible isn't a defense necessarily to this.
The opposite, right?
Yeah, and the opposite is to go and hide. And I don't think that's the course either.
Right. So being visible isn't a defense, meaning that Jews who are identifiable as such, usually Orthodox or Haredi Jews, are specifically often targeted. But look, Colleyville, Texas, that dude had to Google to find that synagogue, right? It's a tiny place in a tiny town that happens to be in, close to a federal prison where a specific prisoner was being held. And, somebody spilled the beans that the 4 Jews at that synagogue control the federal prison sentencing system, which I don't know. I thought that was supposed to be our little secret that we controlled the federal prisons, but that guy found out. Yeah, so like you could be in the middle of like nowhere, Texas, and they come for like that's a thing. No different. It's everywhere. It's a global thing. You don't need Jews to be around for people to become anti-Semitic, right? So all of this.
It's the irony of all this, Rabbi, and I think you've expressed it in past presentations that you've done, where part of the trope is that we control the media and social, and yet we're losing that battle. And we're using it to this next generation. And that's where I was coming from with the Kanye West. That's a whole generation we're going to lose in terms of their perception of what Jewish people are.
Right. So it depends, but that is a thing where, and I do often think of social media, and it's out of controlness parallel to and Stephen, like references the rise of the Nazis, which is essentially using new media intelligently to achieve one's nefarious ends. And obviously, rap stars and troubled basketball guys aren't Nazis, and it's important to make that distinction. And just social media, like we don't have a grip on it, and without gatekeepers, we do a lot of time. There were gatekeepers who kept the lid on this stuff in the media in general, especially post-war, and for whatever the strengths and weaknesses of having 3 big networks were, they had return addresses and they acted, and for these issues of bigotry they tried to act responsibly, and that's no longer the case because anything can get out there, and with and it's going to presumably only increase, one would think, with Twitter loosening up, but already it's out there. And of course, I mentioned before, like all you gotta do is, Kanye is just sort of like not smart in using the word Jews, accusing Jews. All he has to do is substitute in the word Zionist, and you can communicate the same thing, and it's protected political speech instead of hate speech. All you gotta do is make that switch, and you're good. So that I don't think there's an actual threat, but whenever those things happen again, we'll just treat it like it's God forbid it happens again. We'll treat it like a weather warning, and you gotta do what you gotta do. That's our role in the world, is to try and push back against these things. So with that, so we'll leave that alone. Hopefully that's done. We do have a custom, or often in my classes there's a custom of somebody, it's harder to do here after because we're virtual, but a number of times in the last few years, somebody has asked me immediately in the wake of an Israeli election to break it down for them. So I will pause and ask you, do you want to just dive into Torah? Do you want to spend a couple of minutes breaking down the results of the Israeli election of the last week? Or you can get that somewhere else. You don't need me to do it.
I'd like to hear about the election.
Election.
We'll do a couple of minutes, but not a ton.
Election
You
Yes,
got
like to get your take.
All right. So, but my take is going to be somewhat muted because I'm in my role as rabbi. If you want,
Right.
you want, if you want like the full version of what I really think, come up to me at Kiddush.
Right,
But
right.
if I'm sitting like in the chair, like as it were, like there's a certain neutrality about to it. Like so, fifth election in 4 years, which was bad, right? That much democracy is a bad thing. Democracy is a good thing, and the Israeli system clearly wasn't working because they were locked in these continual deadlocks of again 5 elections in 4 years because neither side could break through. If you came of age paying attention to Israel in the battles between right and left, those battles are really over and the left has lost. The last few elections haven't been between right and left. They've been between right and center, because the left wing had really shrunk over the course of the 21st century, really following the first Intifada to a relatively small camp. So really sort of the last few elections have been right versus center, and even that almost not so ideological, not even the way that American politics can be ideological, but the last few elections were really about Netanyahu or not Netanyahu, meaning about his personality, because on some of the big items, especially the big items that American Jews tend to see as, or the world looks at Israel as being important, like relations with the Palestinians. The difference between the outgoing prime minister, Yair Lapid, and Benjamin Netanyahu almost is one of style and not of substance. There's not going to be a Palestinian state under Lapid, and there's not going to be one under Netanyahu. Like either way, like that's not. And Iran, the other sort of big ticket item, also I think not so different. Meaning, Lapid was just as staunchly opposed to the Iranian bomb development as Bibi was. Stylistically, they were different. It's clear that Lapid was working behind the scenes with the Biden administration to pressure them not to enter a deal, both publicly and privately, just not as publicly, not as aggressively as Netanyahu had done it with Obama. So that, I think, so the difference might not be as great as the appearance is, but stylistically, there is a big difference. And the way each individual is perceived, which camp they're perceived as being in. Israel is a largely tribal society. People respond to the group that they are supposed to be a part of. So I hope you're looking at what I'm looking at, which is a page from Yediot Ahronot. These are the seats that pulled out. Netanyahu will form the next government. The Likud, his bloc, there are 120 seats in the Knesset, right? So you need 61 to form a government. You need 61 out of that 100 and out of that 120. The reason there were deadlocks is because there's a percentage of Arab votes that end up usually being non-aligned, meaning often in somewhere between in the last few elections, it was between 10 and 14 of votes from the Arab sector that weren't a part of any government. So neither side could reach 61 because both would end up with 56 and 57. But because there were 10 to 15 votes usually that were taken out of circulation because they belonged to the Arab parties who didn't align with either camp, no one can get to 61. And the last government, the outgoing government, for the first time, an Arab party broke away from the larger factions and was included for the first time as an independent Arab party in the government. This was the Ram party, representing an Islamist party, actually relatives of the Muslim Brotherhood, but a peaceful corner of that world that were courted both by Netanyahu and by Lapid to join their coalition. They ended up joining with Lapid for the first time. This time that stalemate was broken, partly because, this is my brother calling, probably also concerned about my well-being. Likud gets 32 votes, 32 seats in the Knesset, the largest party, as they were last time, but this time they'll be able to form a government. Because these 32 for Netanyahu, along with 14 for Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, this is the big change in this election, which is religious Zionism, Tzionut Hadatit. Religious Zionism is a party that's extreme right-wing, that is composed of smaller parties that joined together at the urging of Netanyahu so that they could garner more votes together than they could separately. And when I say extreme, it means that they're looking to, one, expand settlement building, not just within the existing settlements. That's something that the previous government, the current Prime Minister Lapid, would do as well. But new settlements in new places, deeper into the post-67 territories, into the West Bank, and to legalize settlements that sometimes are of questionable legality, or which are illegal, meaning built on land that the people settling them don't own, or to expropriate land otherwise owned by Palestinians for new settlements, using the same sort of eminent domain that most governments use worldwide to build highways. If your house is in the way of the highway, they'll use eminent domain to grab it away. This is religious Zionism wants to do that with not for highways but for settlements in the West Bank. Smotrich, its leader, has said that he would like to get rid of the laws preventing or allowing politicians to be charged with corruption. Netanyahu is obviously on trial for corruption. He wants to remove those laws. And Ben-Gvir, the number two, who's the breakaway celebrity star of this election, is a Kahanist, has said that he wants to encourage Arab citizens of Israel, not Palestinians in the West Bank only, but citizens of Israel, to emigrate because they're not Jewish, and has a long history of flirting with terrorists. So it's sort of, that's the big change this time around, is that they've been empowered. And there's a third party in this grouping of 14, the Noam Party, that is also something of an extremist party, specifically anti-LGBT, that gays are ruining society, and that we should remove protections for the gay community. So this is the big change. They used to be marginal, but they gained a significant amount of power in this election, and that's the big switch. So 32 for Netanyahu, 14, that brings him to 46, plus 11 Shas. This is Sephardic ultra-Orthodox party. So what did I say? 32 plus that's 46 plus 11, 57, plus 7 for United Torah Judaism. This is the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party. So that brings us to 64. So well above the 61 seats, well above the 61 seat threshold. And the difference with this election as opposed to the past ones, in the past, most all of Bibi's governments have had to rely on a centrist party or a left-wing party to prop them up. This is the first time he's had only right-wing parties propping him up. So every coalition is diverse. This is, in a sense, the least diverse, in that it's the first time Israel's had a government that is only right-wing and ultra-Orthodox parties. So that's going to be the big difference. Netanyahu obviously is a known quantity, but now he's working with different people. The other big thing here is Yesh Atid, Lapid's party, centrist secular, largely secular party, gets 24 seats. Benny Gantz, the current outgoing defense minister, has 12. This is a combination of center right wing parties. And Yisrael Beitenu, this is right wing on security issues, secular in its nature, mainly Russian immigrants from the former Soviet Union, Avigdor Lieberman's party. So they're right wing on Palestinian type issues, but very secular and left wing. So they're on the outs with the ultra Orthodox parties. This is Ra'am. This is the Islamist party that aligned with Prime Minister Lapid in the last government. They got 5 seats. So they won't be in this current government, but it does seem to be a reward for their aligning, for their joining the government. This is and Hadash Tal is the old Arab Joint List. These are the non-aligned Arab votes, often non-Zionists. Mansour Abbas, the leader of the Ram party, said Israel is a Jewish state. Whether or not I like it, that's what it is, and it's not going to change. So that sort of like counts as moderate. Here, they're like, this shouldn't be a Jewish state. It should just be a straight democracy without this sort of core identity. Their numbers went down because they jettisoned a third part. There were 3 parties together. They got rid of a third one, and the third one didn't make the cut. They didn't get any seats, so all those votes were wasted, as it were. So their size of party went down. This is Labor. Labor Party controlled Israel from the start. For its first 30 years, it was Labor in charge, and in the 90s, they could get 40 seats, and even 10 years ago, they could get 25 or so. Now they're barely passing the minimal threshold. And Meretz, the far left party, Jewish party, barely missed the threshold by about like 3,500 votes. They had 3,500 more votes, they would have 4 seats. They didn't get to the minimum level that you have to get in, so they get 0. This is the collapse of the left. These are the 2 left-wing parties that championed peace with the Palestinians, and they have a total of 4 seats. There's like Russian immigrants have more. Like this is, and this, by the way, is where I think a lot of non-Orthodox American Jews would end up. But you see, it is among the Israeli electorate, it is very, very, very vanishingly small. So the result is there'll be a stable government, probably. There probably won't be elections for a little while because these groups are aligned, and it will be more, even though Netanyahu is the same Netanyahu, it'll likely be more right-wing than it has been, really, ever. That's my spiel.
Bringing Netanyahu back, though. Why do they? It seems like they keep having these elections over and over again. Why do they just not have any? Look, I don't have a strong opinion about him personally, but it seems like he's under investigation for corruption. It seems like they've had a lot of elections. There's nobody else that can lead this party. The whole country can't find anybody else to unite behind. He's
positioned himself as the indispensable man, and I think like on some level, so the corruption charges are ongoing. They'll be paused now that it becomes prime minister. But like in American politics, people tend to look past the sins of the person who is leading their camp. Democrats were willing to support Bill Clinton, even, if he was fooling around on the side, and we all knew it. Certainly the Republican Party will look the other way. When somebody's caught doing something wrong, it's like, well, I'd rather have this person than the alternative. So with Netanyahu, he has enough loyalists that no one else can get past him until he steps aside. In the last few elections, you wouldn't have had so many elections if Netanyahu had stepped aside, meaning that these centrist parties, Yesh Atid, National Unity, what's now National Unity, Yisrael Beitenu, would have joined a government with Likud if Netanyahu was not the head, meaning you could have avoided all of these elections with just changing the head of the party and kept the same policies. But that's not what people wanted. They'd rather have Netanyahu.
Rabbi,
He's 73.
Rabbi, I think also, in addition to the items you mentioned, I think some of the right-wing parties want to limit the power of the Supreme Court, which has also been a bastion of civil liberties and liberal democracy in Israel. This result certainly represents a culmination of perhaps what's been going on for at least 40 years, a switch away from the original socialist ideals of Israel. And this really is very indicative of a very dramatic change, in my opinion, in Israeli culture.
Oh yeah. So that, like, again, like, certainly the socialist parties again are here. They're out. Likud's, really, people vote on domestic issues. It's partly the capitalism that helped them rise to power. You mentioned actually what might be for me at least, the most concerning thing, which is the Smotrich and Ben Gvir in religious Zionism say that they would like to end the practice of judicial review, and judicial review, meaning the courts being able to strike down a law as, we would say, unconstitutional, and in Israel meaning against the basic laws, is sort of that's what preserves a democracy, meaning that the courts get to protect the minority from a tyranny of the majority. And that obviously is the role of the courts in the United States in part, so that if you're so that people are so that minorities can be protected, and they specifically want to get rid of that, pass a law saying that can't happen, so that they can pass laws that won't be struck down by the courts. This is part, so that actually is one of the more concerning things, because that's not a hallmark of democracy, meaning democracies require courts to strike down unconstitutional laws, and if that's not there, it's concerning.
Rabbi, how are the Supreme Court justices in Israel lifetime judges?
It is a term, and there's a mandatory retirement age. So it's like I can't remember, I used to know this. Might be like a 10-year term or something like that. And there is it's like 70, it's like a relatively young mandatory retirement age, and they cycle through. It's not the system we have here where, if you can get a 45-year-old on the court, you might have a 40-year spot. It's not so that, and they do and one of the party platforms here also is a change. There's a commission that helps appoint the Supreme Court justices, and it's made up in part of other judges, and they want to switch it so that they're all political appointees. And so that's part of it, which is that that this faction may be less committed to traditional democratic principles than has historically been a choice. The ultra-Orthodox parties tend not to care. These guys, they don't really care that much, the vis-a-vis the West Bank or a lot of foreign policy issues. It's not their thing. Just fund the schools and give us military exemptions, and we'll be all right. Like this time around, a big, the left that had the leftist parties that were in power placed taxes on sugary drinks and plastics. So if you have Shabbos dinners, have a lot of Coca-Cola and Pepsi Cola and disposable silverware. So they're angry. So that was an election issue, and one of their promises, we're going to get rid of the sugary drink tax and the plastic plate tax, because these are important things to so all these other issues, they're sort of less concerned with. These guys are concerned with it, and that's the big difference. This, again, Likud, known quantity. This is religious Zionism is the big change. and will be the source of stress between the Biden administration and the new government. Will come from these guys. Again, there are people in there who are not good characters. So that's the big thing. Is this, but it's where we're at, and
Well, it's also interesting how we, with the whole Iranian situation, on top of seems like Israel's hedging themselves with both Ukraine and Russia in terms of support. So that's going to be very interesting how that works out.
Right. Yeah. So famous. So right. So they've been Lapid and Bennett, both as prime ministers, have hedged their position, because Russians have controlled Syrian airspace, and Iran moves weapons to and through Syria. Israel frequently bombs in Syria, and so doesn't want to anger Russia in that regard. So that's part of why no offensive weapons and even defensive weapons have gone to Ukraine from Israel. The Ukrainians have pressed hard for Iron Dome technology. Most of the missiles being fired by Russia are longer range into Ukraine, so the Iron Dome wouldn't work. Iron Dome is designed for shorter range missiles and rockets, but Israel won't sell Iron Dome to Ukraine, and it seems to be not to avoid angering Russia. Bibi had a relationship with Putin. What it means to have a relationship with Putin is is a different thing entirely. But that when I say that, I think in a lot of these issues, foreign policy issues, I'm not convinced there's a huge difference between Lapid and Netanyahu on these things. It is more one of tone. Lapid puts out a much more gentle tone than Netanyahu did.
Well, not to be glib, but to quote the Temptations, it's a ball of confusion. That's what the world is today.
Right. Yes, and that, by the way, is part of it. Israelis that's the decline of the left, which is to say, it's clear that Israeli voters don't feel safe to the same extent. That's one thing. The other thing is, if you look at the raw numbers, there's an 8,000 vote difference between this election, giving Netanyahu a strong majority, and the last election when he was put into the opposition, meaning that 8,000 votes are the difference between what we see this time and what we saw last time. And the reason for that is that, I'll share the screen one last time, better to have that Netanyahu encouraged smaller parties to join together. So this is a combination of three parties, and that allowed him to get all of these votes. Lapid wanted these two parties to join together, but they didn't. And so all of these votes got thrown away. This is the threshold line. Below this, you don't get any seats. If they would have combined, as they could have, they'd have the same number. They would have the same number of seats as this party. These two combined vote-wise is the same as this, but they didn't combine, and so all these votes got thrown away. Also, these are these Arab parties that ran together last time also were together, and one broke away. Lapid told them to stay together, but they didn't. So here also, these two together would be this same number of votes. So the left threw away votes in a way that the right did not. And that's by design. Netanyahu pressured groups that he used to disagree with to join together and said, I'll support you so that you don't fall below this line. Because if you fall below this line, then your votes don't count. But if you combine with people, if you compromise and combine, you'll make it over. And they did. And the left did not do that. And so the numbers the raw number of votes aren't that different. The left just divided themselves. It's the, if I can do the reference, it's like the People's Liberation Front of Judea and the Judean People's Liberation Front. If you remember this Monty Python bit of left-wing groups where like they have these like tiny differences, but they all like hate each other, even though they're essentially the same. That's what went on the left.
Yeah, Rabbi, I just read, I think it was in the Times very recently over the past couple of days, that, and I don't remember exactly when this happened, you probably do, but Israel raised the threshold for the groups to get a seat in the Knesset, and that may have impacted. I mean, I guess Bibi played the game better, and was able to get those smaller splinter groups together, and now they've got those smaller fringe groups now have a larger voice than they used to.
Yes. So the punchline was, it was so that, and this will be our last thing. So that's famously, in Israel, when it started, you only need 1% of the vote to get a seat, right? And so I mean, imagine what would happen in this country if you allowed 1% of the people to make a decision, right? I mean, he complained about Kyrie Irving. Oh my gosh, I promise you, there's 1% of the people who are on board with that stuff, right? Like we got a system where you choose Biden, you choose Trump, you got one or the other, you got this Tom or you got that Tom, right? Like so like there's these broad camps, but they're like these tiny splinter groups could do it. So they're like, oh, we're letting crazies in. Let's get rid of that. So it went from 1%. And then in the early 90s, they moved it to 2%. And in the early 2010s, they moved to 3.25% to try and get rid of the crazies. But the opposite sort of happened, which is that the crazies, as it were, or the fringe groups, whatever term you want to use, the fringe groups joined together, and so that they would make it above that 3.25%. And as a result, they ended up getting more power. It was designed to try and marginalize them more and keep them out. But Netanyahu correctly, and to his credit, saw how to avoid that fate, and he parlayed it into power. The left should have done the same math. If you wanted the left in power, they should have done the same math, but they didn't. But it's not a mystery. Yeah, so that was done to try and move marginal groups further to the margins, and the opposite happened. So that strange days indeed. So yeah, so that's what's going on. But enough about Israel. Let's talk Torah. I want to switch to Torah. The bracha for Torah study, which is very different from politics. Though again, like so the ideas underlie, but the bracha for Torah study is bracha tanal and machlam b'shek shanu mitzvah tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Wherever you are, you say amen. You should have a copy of Torah in front of you somewhere. If you don't have one, then always you can go to Sefaria.org, and they have multiple Jewish translations of Torah there. But you might have JPS one, you might have Robert Alter. I'm going to look in Richard Elliott Friedman. They also have Alter here and a few others. The beginning. Genesis is really in the beginning, right? Though, which is what I call the class, though, as we'll see, might have mentioned last time, like that's not really a good translation. It's an eloquent translation. But it might not, but the key thing there is the. If it were in the beginning, it would be Bareshit, or Barishonah, really. But it's Bereshit. It's not a kamat. It's a shva. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. Haaretz haya tov v'vohu. I'll do the Hebrew, then we'll do the English. V'oshech al pnei hatom. V'ruach Elohim merchefet al pnei hamayim. V'yom Elohim yior ve'or. Actually, I might use Everett Fox's translation for this first pick here. It was sort of lovely. At the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth, when the earth was wild and waste, darkness over the face of the ocean, rushing spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. We'll continue for a second with the Hebrew. V'yar Elohim et ha'or ki tov, v'yavdel Elohim ben ha'or v'ben ha'osha. God saw the light, that it was good. God separated the light from the darkness. V'ikra Elohim la'or yom, la'osha kara laila, v'erev v'voker yom echad. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was setting and there was dawning. There was one day. I'm gonna pause there. King James translates in the beginning. You might be looking at JPS. Easier to, I don't know. What else you got there? People are looking in different things. How's that first sentence translated in whatever you're looking at?
Rabbi of Alter,
Who says,
when God began to create heaven and earth.
right. When God began to create heaven and earth is different from in the beginning. You know, as I read one that was at the beginning of God's creating heaven and earth. JPS, I think, translates when God began to create heaven and earth. There's a few things going on here. One, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth is a sentence on its own. JPS, certainly with when God began creating heaven and earth, is a subordinate clause. But the important thing is the difference between the one I read at the beginning of God's creating, or when God began to create heaven and earth, is different from in the beginning, because in the beginning means that it's the beginning. When God began to create heaven and earth means that is different. It's like joining, it's like this is when this particular thing began. This is when we're joining our story. In the beginning implies that there's nothing before, that this is that big bang moment and there's nothing, and you can't get before that point. When God began to create heaven and earth is like saying, well, when the World Series began, or whatever the case may be, there's something going on before that. We're just talking about like this event, right? When God began to create the heaven and earth. So it's a whole different vibe. It implies that there's something going on beforehand, but it's not that. In the beginning of my marriage tells you that before that point there was no marriage, but when there was no thing called that. When this is just saying that when this part of the story began, and that's the difference between Bereshit, in the beginning, and Bereshit, in like, which is really a sense of like as it began, as opposed to a hard start. It's just it's a softer start. So that's one thing, is Alter's translation of when God began to create the heaven and the earth is how the sages understood it. I mean, the rabbis of old didn't translate this into English for some reason, but it's clear they understood it as when God began to create. We know that in part because there's midrashim, right? That before God created this world, God created and destroyed 968 other worlds, which is this way of saying that he has a life outside of you, you know, that God, that there were things going on before this moment, and God did stuff. And it's just that we're joining our story here. And this is sort of like the crawl at the beginning of a Star Wars movie, like sort of like saying that there was stuff going on before, but let's catch you up to how to how this particular story begins, which is different from I think how sometimes, or I know from sometimes the story is understood. So Bereshit bara, at the beginning of bara. Bara is a word for created that's only used for God. I mean, it's not used, humans don't ever do anything in the Tanakh that gets the word bara. I mean, so whatever God is doing is different from how we do it. Humans obviously create things, but whatever sort of creation is going on here is somehow qualitatively different because a unique word is used for whatever is going on.
But if there were other worlds created before this story's world begins, then why does it say Bereshit? It was not the first.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, so if you translate it as when God to create the heaven and the earth, it's just sort of like, it's almost as if it imagines, and they wouldn't imagine it the way we imagine it because of the scientific mind, but it may be somewhere in the, in the ballpark that there are other universes. God isn't limited the same way. God's doing different things, and this is this story of what's going on here, but somewhere else there's something else going on. Whatever that story is, that story's there. It's just sort of like not what our story is, right? It's just something else. So that's not accidental. The thought is that well, it might be evident in the text, which is to say, is there anything that pre-exists creation? And if you read verse 2 carefully, I mean, think about it. So in the beginning of God's creating heavens and the earth. Shemayim also same word for sky. So you could say sky and earth if you want.
Rabbi,
And go ahead.
Rabbi,
Phyllis.
I have the Jewish Bible, and it does a nice job with that. It sort of takes everything together. It says, when God began to create heaven and earth, and then there's a dash, the earth being unformed and void.
Right. Yeah. Notice how they make it they make the like that. The JPS makes it a sort of a long run-on sentence, and that first part is a subordinate clause to what comes, and that second verse, and this verse 2 is really a parenthetical expression, the way they render it, right? The earth, like sort of like in parentheses, the earth being here, Richard Elliott Friedman translated, when the earth had been shapeless and formless, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and God's spirit was hovering on the face of the water. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now, if you read that carefully, of course, God creates light, but before the light there is darkness. And where did the darkness come from? Well, we don't know, but it's there. And notice there's the face of the deep, Tehom in Hebrew. Where's this Tehom, this deep, whatever that means? Where does that come from? We don't know. It's there, and there is no let there be statement creating it. For everything else, there's a let there be, and it was. But here, notice the darkness pre-exists our story. The deep, whatever that is, pre-exists our story. God's spirit hovering over the face of the water pre-exists the story. It's everything else is going to get created. But notice these things are already there. Which is weird, right? So notice that this isn't necessarily creation out of nothing. This, if you read closely, you'll see that light is one of the very few things which seems to be created out of nothing. It's something else. Yeah.
In Walters, he has an interesting, he says, then it's when God began to create heaven and earth the earth then was welter and waste. So you can interpret that as saying he started the creation and then things appeared like darkness and water. So they don't necessarily have to predate or precede the creation of heaven and earth.
Right. Then the worst one, it's sort of like, right. So yeah. But there is no let there be statement for them at the very least, where for everything else there is. Right. Then there was the earth then was welter and waste. It's almost, well, the earth could even be pre-existing. It's not entirely clear. At the very least, it's not clear. Welter and waste translates. The King James as well.
It does say welter and waste and darkness, to your
And
point
darkness.
before.
Yeah.
Darkness as well.
Right. That's tohu vavohu, right? And JPS, I think, is unformed and void. Richard Elliott Friedman is shapeless and formless, welter and waste. Tohu vavohu. Tohu vavohu is a unique phrase that doesn't appear anywhere else except in a couple of other texts that refer back to this point, meaning that they're clearly quoting a famous thing. Who was it? Somebody came up to me within the last month and said that they met somebody who had a Hebrew tattoo on their arm, and they're like, what's your tattoo? And the guy said, well, and I said, I can't remember what the guy said. He said that it was from Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. I'm like, it was tohu vavohu, which means something like utter chaos. It's the state of the world before God imposes order on it. It's utter chaos. Shapeless and formless might be it. It's very blob-like. And what is actually one of the translators might have been Everett Fox, says that he wants it, that tohu vavohu might actually mean something like chaos shmeas. But you can't translate as chaos shmeas because it's not dignified enough for a biblical translation. But it's but it's trying to communicate something like things
Emptiness.
are. Pardon me.
Emptiness.
Emptiness. It could be emptiness, but it also is a sense of disarray. And what's going to happen, as you know, what's going to happen is order is going to be imposed on the disarray, and everything's going to be separated. Right. The water. So it's just darkness. There will be light. Light will be separated from darkness. Water will be separated from land. The water above will be separated from the water below. I mean, everything's going to be put in its place, and everything will be, and the chaos will be organized by God. And the entire creation stories can be one of something chaotic, that God is going to fight against the chaos and impose order on it by separating things into their place. And that will become a biblical theme, to the point of we will retain a ceremony called Havdalah, meaning separation, where we talk about the holiness of separating things, so that everything doesn't become a big jumble. So the theme of chaos versus order is a key theme of the first chapter of Genesis, and the tohu vavohu is that. The earth then was chaotic, and what God's going to do is come in and impose order on it.
Rabbi,
Yes.
couldn't that be also where the deep comes in? The deep is bothering me. If you have something very, 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 very dark, and there's absolutely positively no light, you have no balance. You don't know where you are. It's chaotic. I don't know how to explain it, but that's saying the same thing that you are, that it's so very dark. There's absolutely no light.
Right. And the darkness over the surface of the deep gives it that, right?
And then a wind from God sweeps over the water, and you don't have chaos.
Right. Or that's the key thing. The word for ruach there could be wind, or could be life breath, or could be spirit. Something like that is what's going for it. But these and it's hovering over the water. The only other time that word merachepet is used in the Torah is used here for God's spirit, or God's ruach hovering over the primordial water, and it's used at the very end, that God hovers over Israel as an eagle, I think it is, hovers over its nestlings. It's in one of the last chapters of Deuteronomy. It's used only at the very beginning and very end. It's bookending it's a word that's used twice in the Torah, and it bookends the whole story. So whatever it is, it's sort of like a bird hovering over its nestlings. It is sort of the image of God sweeping over the face of the primordial waters. The light.
What is the word? I'm sorry.
Oh, Merachefet.
Yes.
And the mayim here might be primordial water rather than actual water. It's not. We'll get to that next time. And the light isn't the sun, because the sun will come later. The sun's created on day 4. So whatever this is, it's not coming from the sun or the moon or the stars. Those are all day 4. So next time, God willing, there will be no, between now and next week, we're going to solve anti-Semitism, so we won't have any things like that to discuss. The elections we'll do at Kiddush. We can talk about or in a different form than this. So we'll just do Torah next time, God willing. But I do want to add that in a couple of weeks on, what is it, the 17th, we'll in 2 weeks, rather than having regular class here at Shul, next week we'll be here at Shul in 2 weeks, let's go to the JCC. There's a speaker at the JCC, Martin Indyk. He was Clinton's ambassador to Israel, and he wrote a book on Kissinger, Nixon's Secretary of State, and forwards, like his interviewer will be our very own Stephen Offen. So rather than being here in 2 weeks, 7 o'clock JCC, and also December 1st, 7 o'clock JCC, Tova Friedman's going to give a talk on a memoir she wrote of her experiences in the Shoah. So when something important is happening like that, we can go do that instead. But next week here at Shul, 2 weeks at the JCC for Martin Indyk, former ambassador to Israel. Ad Kan.